to the Forge. Anyway, welcome Cecilia Muñoz and Cecile Richards, and it's really great that you're willing to take part in this conversation today. This issue of the Forge that I'm guest editing is about the relationship between philanthropy and organizing, and I'm writing an introductory essay as somebody who came to philanthropy 25 years ago and out of civil human rights stuff knew very little about organizing and learned a lot about it through being a funder of a lot of organizing over the years, and having to make these arguments for support of grassroots action to Atlantic and Open Society, which at least at the time when we were starting it, were not really funding that kind of stuff. And some of the trustees were not that comfortable with it. They understood other kinds of strategies better, and it took a while to kind of get them comfortable with it. And I'm not sure in some ways they ever quite were. So I wanted to ask you two here for this conversation, because while you have prominent roles and reputations in the nonprofit world and in the government world, in Cecilia's case, you served in recent years on some foundation boards and advisory boards, and therefore you've been able to come in the inside of that process. And I think for some of the readers of the Forge who deal with foundations as supplicants or applicants, it's helpful to know a little bit more what goes on in the inside. So I guess the first question I would ask you is, when you first joined a foundation board, I guess Cecilia, 10 or more years ago with Atlantic and Open Society, what was that? When you were asked to do it, did you have any reservations about it? Were you concerned about it, what it'd be like, or just leapt at the opportunity? And what did you find that was surprising to you or different than you might have expected?
Well, as you know, Gara, when you come from the nonprofit sector and a foundation asks you to do something, you generally say yes, right? Because it's part of the relationship building that you need to do in order to position your own work to be able to survive and move forward. I was not at all sure I wasn't going to be a fish out of water. At the time, I was at what was then called the National Council of La Raza, right? I had knowledge of my own community, the Latino community, and knowledge of the nonprofit sector as a grantee. But I was frequently the only person like me and I'm on a bunch more philanthropy boards now, and that's still the case. But obviously the skill set and the knowledge of constituency, the knowledge of movement and how to move things forward turns out to be really useful on a foundation board, because boards, each one is different, but the board members themselves are not so much in the grant making business, but we do tend to be in the sort of strategy business, right? Helping foundation leadership set a course, set a direction, and maybe even a set of metrics of what they want to accomplish. And, the more knowledge you can bring about what the tools are that help you accomplish that, the better. But at first I wasn't at all sure that was a skill set that would transfer. And it turns out to be a really vital skill set for philanthropies that really want to move the needle, as they say.
Are any of the boards, I'm also on a couple of foundation boards, and most of the boards that I'm on don't really approve grants. They do strategy, and I really identify with what you say about being asked by a funder to do something. But also there's a question which we can get to about how one uses one's voice in that kind of setting when you're also a grantee, which is the case for some activists who are on foundation boards. Cecile, what about that question for you? Was it Ford or JPB? What was your first foundation board?
Yeah, I joined the Ford Foundation board, I guess about 10 years ago. And it was, the Ford Foundation, I think, has always had some mix of practitioners and other experts. It's, and I guess Cecilia, like Cecilia said, when a foundation asks you to do something, the answer is yes. And in this case, it was a really, really exciting opportunity, because in the same way, Gara, that you said, sort of the interest in some people are not sure what organizing is, and other people are not sure what philanthropy is. It's sort of interesting to sit in those spots where you're almost can feel a little bit like a translator for the other. And I do think still for folks who come out of organizing that, yeah, people sort of like tend to turn down the table and look at you as if like, okay, can you explain what it is we're this sort of foreign topic? I think that for me, it's been extraordinarily humbling, and because one of the things I feel like I've learned both from being on the Ford Foundation board and the other philanthropic engagements like this is just how hard good grant making is. You know, when you're always on the receiving end, you have an idea of like, why isn't this happening? Why isn't that happening? And I do think I've learned a lot about just how challenging it is, particularly if you're putting a stake in the ground, as I think most of the philanthropies that we're talking about, putting the stake in the ground about really actually making big social change on a really tough topic. It's, I think, and Cecilia, I'd be interested in what you think, but usually you're not like just like, chewing around the edges. You're actually kind of full in, and certainly Gara, that's been the foundations that you've been involved in. And then you realize, wow, it may seem like this foundation has a lot of resources, but they're trying to take on really, really big problems, and there isn't a single answer. So for me, I feel like I hope I've learned a little to be a little more humble about just how hard it is to do this really well, to hold yourself accountable as a foundation, to recognize the things you did that really worked and those that didn't work, and that's okay. Because if you aren't making mistakes, you're probably not trying hard enough. So anyway, it's been really interesting, and I think that I'm sure you'll get into it. I do think too, sitting on a board where you're also a grantee it's complicated, and so leave it at that.
Yeah. The boards that I'm on, the foundation boards that I'm on, I often get approached by people who want to reach the foundation. And of course, I had this happen to me when I was the president of a couple of foundations, that, my trustees would get a question from somebody and they would, you always try to be responsive to your trustees, but most of them, understood that they really shouldn't get involved with that. I find that I don't really have much, I don't bring much to the foundation in the sense that I'm not putting issues on their agenda. They have their staff and they're driving forward. At best, you're kind of reacting to their strategic plan, and you're kind of bringing whatever knowledge or experience you have to it. So how have you felt, either of you, that tension because you come out of the field or to some extent still in it, and people expect that somehow you might be a route to the foundation involved, or they try to kind of get you? Maybe I've done that with each of you, I don't know. But how do you feel about, how do you handle that tension, or is it a tension?
Oh, I'll start. It's absolutely a tension. And it's, and I've done it myself as a person for an NGO, right? If you are trying to move forward on an issue and you're trying to develop a fundraising strategy, one of the things you look at is who's on which board. Right. And it turns out to be kind of a terrible strategy, because as a board member, it's kind of explicitly not your job to interfere with what the staff is doing and engage in individual grant making. So like, I make a practice sometimes, because of the work that I do, I can see a connection between, the really exciting higher ed work that's happening at a foundation whose board I sit on, and some people who are doing really cool stuff and know that they should be talking to each other. But I go out of my way to always copy the foundation president, because I don't feel comfortable as a trustee engaging with the staff without them being aware. And then always saying, this is a connection I thought might be useful, not but no obligation. I won't be offended. Like, I'm not trying to tell you what to do, because it's important actually to honor the staff's role and to not kind of, as a trustee, you're kind of not supposed to micromanage. But I have also found that, as you say, you tend to respond to strategic plans and provide insights and advice. But this last year, pretty much everywhere I sat, because of the uprising in response to George Floyd's murder, because of this kind of moment of the pandemic and the economic crisis and the, crisis in racial justice, which we've been dealing with since forever, that there was room for conversations about what aren't we doing that meets the moment, like, and it is possible to take advantage of opportunities like that to really focus your fellow trustees in a foundation on, like, is business as usual the right approach here, or is there something else we should be doing? And you saw a lot of foundations stepping up
Right.
and shifting their strategies in response to what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. If I could just pick up on what Cecilia said, because it is, foundations are just by their sort of DNA, thoughtful, slow moving, sometimes ponderous. And it is interesting to sit on a board where you're in the thick of some of the work that's happening. And I hope that's a valuable role that those of us who come out of organizing and advocacy can play, to call out that, the house is on fire. Interesting to me, and then really, certainly sitting on the Ford Foundation board, where in many ways the president is ahead of everybody, and really is responsive in the moment. But it's great to actually be in a situation like that where you can actually help, as you say, not just make grants, but actually think about big, bold moves that can be done pretty quickly. Because I don't, and I hope in some ways that is, it's a model that can be instructive, because I think that, as we know, there are a lot of foundations that are pretty insulated from current events. And it's been exciting to see how many have, as Cecilia said, have stepped up.
Yeah, there just seemed, I've been a big critic of philanthropy while practicing it, but I also really have to say that in the last year, it seems to me that there has been greater responsiveness in the field in significant amounts, by many foundations, and that, some of the leadership that people like Darren are taking and changing the practices of foundations so they can be more responsive, is really moving in the right direction, quite a bit in the right direction. I've only worked for living donor, as a staff member for living donor foundations, and for, Sfini and Soros were quite different from one another, but, we had a kind of an activist orientation and could move fairly quickly. Do you each of you serve on both living donor boards and more traditional trustee boards? Do you notice any difference there in terms of responsiveness and nimbleness?
I think it can work both ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge of working with the living donors, that's kind of where the buck literally stops.
Right.
And so it's a little bit less predictable. And the thing about a sort of more institutionalized foundation is that they generally fall back on kind of practices that they've established over time, expertise that they've established over time. Sometimes that can make them less nimble. It also can make them also more expert.
Mm-hmm.
And I've kind of seen kind of the whole range. I think, but in all circumstances, it's really important to kind of have your eyes open to current circumstances and not assume that because a certain foundation's been doing things a particular way or has like great expertise on issue X, that means that kind of the way they've been doing it is really is the right way. I at times have deeply valued the expertise that foundation staff develop. They really become experts in a field, and if they're driving a field forward successfully, and it's being done skillfully and respectfully, it can be an extraordinary catalyst. It can also be, and I've experienced this as a grantee, it can also be an obstacle to doing the kind of work in community that you think is necessary. But you're trying to do it and leverage the foundation that may not be in the same place. I've seen all of those things be true, and being authentically engaged with the community of people whose lives you're also trying to influence, I think is a really essential ingredient, and it's easier for some foundations than others.
Cecilia, anything?
Well, I would just say it's. I sit on two foundation boards. They're very different. One is, very long established. Other is newer and less out in the public eye. But they both actually have been, I think, incredibly responsive to the current events of the, and situation. And it's exciting to see, because I think that, and because I wouldn't have it any other way. Also because a lot of foundations were established when things moved more glacially. We are living in an era when change is happening so rapidly, whether it's because of technology, the growing, inequality, certainly, this summer in the United States and ongoing, the racial unrest, the murder of George Floyd, as Cecilia mentioned, these are not things you can now spend 2 years making a strategic plan around if you're actually going to be helpful in the moment. And so I guess I think always foundations, of course, care about their reputation and their legacy. But I have been really moved at how willing both foundations have been to take risks. And I think and Cecilia, I'd be really so interested in your thinking about this too, is that I actually feel like the more that there are outliers, foundations that are really kind of breaking the mold, doing things really bold, it does, I assume, begin to create conversations on other foundation boards. Like I was really interested in when Ford began doing working more in, taking some of their assets and really actually trying to make strategic investments to better the causes they cared about, and that I begin to see that ripple on other foundation boards, looking at the makeup of the board, thinking about what do you do with in a moment of crisis and making big bets, doing more general support. That I think is also really, it's been a really interesting path to see that this is a world that is frankly often very impervious to the rest of, doesn't have a lot of pressure points. And I love seeing how much it can become, how much we can influence, or folks can influence their peers.
Yeah, I was thinking, I was struck the other day, I had an exchange with John Palfrey at MacArthur because I looked at his annual letter, which I thought was really superb and, so race forward. And MacArthur, all respect, was not a foundation in past years as great as it was, that I associated very much with that, unlike, let's say, a Ford or in recent years, Open Society. And, I don't know whether that's his leadership or the Times or some combination of both, or trustees even, but it seemed to me to represent some significant movement. And I found that true of a lot of mainstream foundations. And I do think the leadership that comes from some of the folks that you have worked with in your different foundations, a Darren Walker, a Patrick Gaspard, a Barbara Pickauer, does have a big ripple effect on some other foundations. Remember, Cecilia, I first met you 25 years ago when we started the Emma Lazarus Fund at Open Society, and I often tell the story of how the idea for it came at the end of another session at George Soros's house. We were meeting about some campaign finance reform. And at the end of it, he kept R.A. Nair and me back. And he said, I'd like you to, I'm really upset about the welfare bill, that Clinton had just signed. and they cut off the benefits for illegal immigrants. I want to spend $50 million to deal with it, and I was very new, a couple months in the job. That seemed like a lot of money to me. It still is a great deal of money. And so one or both of you may know Rosa Brooks, who then in her early 20s, and I had hired her to be a note taker for the session. And so she was hanging around with Arya and me and said, you could call it the Emma Lazarus Fund. And so it was September 7th when we had that discussion. And on September 30th, 3 weeks later, we were announcing the fund and the director of the fund, Antonio Maciel, at the National Press Club. Now that's pretty good turnaround. You don't see that very often, but it was one of the things I always thought with Soros anyway, that was a benefit of a living donor that, was just willing to cut through it all.
And you netted $15 billion in advocacy.
It's one of the greatest ROIs in philanthropy. Yes, exactly. Yep. Because, George, actually, because we're talking about advocacy and organizing, Soros was never comfortable, and I haven't talked to George that recently about it. I don't know how much he may have evolved, but I know the foundation's doing a lot of great things. But Soros was generally uncomfortable with, first in the early years, with much advocacy at all, much less organizing, which he tended to associate with populist movements of Europe that he had escaped. You know, it wasn't something he really, people in the streets is not something that makes him that comfortable. So with respect to the Emma Lazarus Fund, he wanted most of it to go to services. You know, he wanted to help people become citizens. And of course that was good. And we did a lot of English language and legal assistance and so on. But, you know, probably about 20% we spent on advocacy, which really, in my view, helped people, but at the same time, you know, move the debate so that Congress could eventually restore the benefits. A lot of times when I think about trying to get foundations to support organizing, I think about, and one of you used this word earlier, I think it was Cecile. I always felt my job as the CEO was, among my jobs, was to translate between the field and my own staff very often and more establishment boards and find a way, you know, to convince a George Soros or a Leon Botstein or Herb Sturz or whoever it was, you know, who are generally comfortable with think tanks or public interest legal stuff, but not so much with, you know, grassroots stuff, you know, to kind of get that as a technique. So I'm curious from both of you, in the foundation board settings in which you sat, if you find yourself playing that role, how does that, you know, with people who don't come from the same place that you do, corporate types and so on, what works, or how have you found that, what kind of arguments have you found effective?
Well, I'll say one thing, because it was really during my time at Ford, but it's still an example that I think of as such a clear representation of how funding advocacy and funding grassroots efforts matters. So Ford was a big funder of healthcare delivery for Planned Parenthood. And that was great. We built a number of health centers in the Deep South with the support of George and George Soros and the Ford Foundation and others. But passage of the ACA, and which of course, I know, Gara, you had a lot to do with what happened during that time, funding efforts to actually make a big bet and change public policy, that did more to put birth control and healthcare, make it available for millions, literally millions of people in this country, more than any clinic that we could ever build. And both those things went together, right? You almost have to have the sort of the healthcare delivery system that we had at Planned Parenthood and match it up with the grassroots organizing. But it was so powerful. And I still try to explain to folks that, like, when you can say, yes, you could build clinics and provide care, but when you can get 70 million women birth control at no cost, that actually is going to have a just generational effect. And so I think it is hard to sometimes fund or get foundations to fund organizing or advocacy. So I think the more we can sort of break it down into simple pieces, and I mean, Cecilia, you must have a million examples of things where all that work over years and years and years, and finally, the tumblers fall in place and you have systems change.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes it's breaking down the pieces, but almost always it's making the connection between, I mean, it's not just advocacy or organizing for its own sake, it's making the connection between organizing and the result, right? Which you just did in describing tens of millions of people got healthcare as a result of this sort of combination of service and advocacy. And I think as a trustee, one of the things you can do as someone who comes from sort of a movement is make that connection so that others who maybe are a little afraid of advocacy can see actually the return on investment that you can get. And sometimes the philanthropy itself steps up as an advocate. And this is what I'm a trustee of the Kresge Foundation, which is based in Detroit, which is my hometown. And they're almost a century old. But when Detroit went bankrupt, the relatively new president of the Kresge Foundation, a really wonderful, skilled human named Rip Rapson, had gotten to know the sort of civic infrastructure of the city. And while the philanthropic world and the business world, and for that matter, the federal government, which is where I was at the time, were wondering whether Detroit, frankly, was worth investing in, he literally drew a map. he's really good with a pen,
Yeah.
and drew a map of the civic infrastructure and showed it to people
Yeah.
and convinced a lot of folks that this was an investment worth making. And Kresge and Ford were actually the lead donors in an effort that saved the city, really, and convinced the federal government that, gave the advocates within the federal government the ability to say, this is not going to be throwing good money after bad, that there is a rescue to be had here. And that was really the result of expertise and leadership and some risk taking within a philanthropy. So that sometimes the edgy strategy emerges from a philanthropy itself, which is, rare, but really wonderful when it happens.
Well, in foundations, I teach a course on philanthropy and public policy, or I have taught a course. And, there's a lot of examples of that kind of thing, but people don't think of foundations very much as being risk takers, but sometimes they are. And when they are, the best role for foundation, arguably, is to be able to be kind of venture capital for, social innovation. And there's, public television, there's a whole litany of, things, Sesame Street or whatever, that have come to be that the foundations invested in and made a point about, proving a point that other people could then invest in. I sometimes find it, back to the ACA, when we're working on the ACA with HCAN and so on, and Cecilia was on the inside of this at the time, but and Cecile was on the steering committee, I think, of HCAN, if I recall. Planned Parenthood was very active in it. And, there was a question of the financing mechanism, and there was some discussion about tinkering with the charitable deduction to get more money into the system. And I found myself on the other side of virtually all of institutional philanthropy, because they were saying, no, don't touch our tax break. And I was saying, well, wouldn't it be better to have public investment in a democratically determined, public good, but they didn't. A lot of them didn't see it that way. Although some, like California Endowment and Soros, also invested, but it was mostly labor unions and not so much foundations. Partly because it was a heavy advocacy lift, and a lot of foundations don't have the C4 capacity, for instance, that we had at Atlantic. Well, as I wrap this up and let you go, because I'm really appreciative of your time this afternoon, let me ask two other things, and one you can take a pass on if you wish. But and that is, so about this tension, which I've seen from the staff side, as I've had people on the boards, who've been from movement organizations. How do you navigate that? You're, in some of the roles you've had, organizations that you're connected with, maybe you're a trustee, maybe you're a staff member, are getting funds from the foundation. And, you could imagine that would, first, of course, you say yes when a foundation asks you, but also, is there ever a time when you have to think twice about how to use your voice and maybe be less critical than you might have been? I don't know if either of you have had that situation. And then the final question I want you to think about is just the whole larger setting about philanthropy. When you're in foundations, as I've been for 20 some years, you tend to see them as the center of the universe, but of course they are not and shouldn't be. And, is there a problem, even if foundations are moving in the right direction toward boldness and even to some degree accountability, is that really the way we want the world to work, that organizations are so dependent on these large and often not in a literal sense accountable institutions? And how do you deal with that tension, or is it a tension that concerns you at all? So two tensions.
So, I can't say that I've ever felt like I was in a situation where I couldn't be critical, which at least so far. And in fact, as a kind of participant in the system, I think it's actually really important to be able to be critical of the sector and make sure that it is functioning in as accountable a way as possible and as an effective a way as possible. When you're a grantee, you have to be super scrupulous about recusals and making sure, like, I think that's a place where I try to go the extra mile to just make sure that there's never sort of any ethical entanglements. But it's tremendously important that, we're in this moment where there are a lot of people taking a newly critical eye to philanthropy in a way that I think makes for a really valuable discussion. And those discussions should be happening around board tables within philanthropies. And that's, I think, part of the role that you play. I feel very strongly about it is, I mean, I am rarely now the only Latino in the room. I used to be frequently the only Latino in a room. I consider that like a modicum of progress, but, there is a degree to which, as a person of color, I feel a sense of responsibility to be able to speak the truth in those boardrooms as I see it, and bring a critical eye and some critical thinking to it, which ultimately the places where I serve welcome that, and they kind of know that's what they're getting when they ask me on.
I completely 100% agree with Cecilia on there. I've never felt that I couldn't say what sort of speak my mind, but maybe because I didn't think first, but I do. I mean, you have to be super thoughtful about, not being involved in conversations that relate to a grant that you might be for the work you're doing. Look, I think all the daylight and sunlight going onto foundations and how they operate and making them accountable is really, really valuable. And I was thinking about something, Gara, it's not exactly the question you asked, but it's a real honor to sit on a foundation board. Let's be honest. This is a place of enormous privilege, and sometimes you are sitting on a board where you're not running in the same circles, if you will, of the folks that you're on the board with. And one of the things that's been interesting to me is and so there's this sort of like, there's like not us and them, but it's like oftentimes I think people who sit on the boards of foundations, they'd like to have more of a point of view about like organizing and advocacy and grassroots, but it's like these are like two different worlds. And to me, I have learned how important it is, particularly when we talk about, expertise of foundations versus expertise in the field. And I know one of the growing trends, I hope, certainly has been at Ford, is to provide more long-term general support for organizations and leaders who are just doing really good work. And as opposed to making people jump through a bunch of hoops, sometimes you're just saying, we believe in you, we trust what you're doing, you probably know better than we do, no matter how expert our staff is in what needs to happen in your field. I do think having folks like Cecilia Muñoz on a board gives that credibility to the field that we need, and being in the room where it happens is incredibly important. So being able to trust grantees, trust the field. Again, I don't think people are doing it intentionally sometimes, but sometimes it's like asking people to think about a world they really have never like delved into. And so that role, even if it's complicated, which I think we've all acknowledged it is, the role of having practitioners there that I hope bring some legitimacy to the extraordinary field of advocacy and organizing that is happening in this world, most times with like two nickels to rub together and, stretched so thin. I really appreciate that this move, which I think is happening more, to recognize that sometimes philanthropy's job is to, and Gara, this is really, I feel like, has been your MO for all your many years, is just give the money to people that you believe are doing good work and trust them to do it.
Amen.
Yeah. And I think that the big difference about having people on the board is folks like you are the peers of the other board members. I mean, when I was running Open Society, 20, 25 years ago, I didn't do much to change the board, which was mostly academics that George was fairly comfortable with. It wasn't a trench that I chose to die in. So I got him to put Lonnie Guinier on the board, and she became a great advocate. But and not that the other trustees weren't pathetic, although they were often kind of in those days in George's shadow, and so they were very accomplished people who often didn't find ways to be independent minded. So Ann Beeson, to her great credit, after I left, diversified the board both by race and gender, and also with people from the field, Cecilia and Brian Stevenson, I think at one point, and a whole bunch of people from the field. And when those people are sitting in a room, it's one thing to have a staff person make an argument, or to have a very, an activist staff, or to bring folks into the room as presenters, which often happens. But when the people who have the power, or to whom the president of the foundation or the donor is looking for advice, if those people are sitting there as peers of the other trustees, it's a very different dynamic. So I'm grateful to both of you for doing that, and hope you continue to do it as long as you wish to. And I really appreciate you taking some time this afternoon to talk with me about it, because I think it'll be very helpful to the organizing community that is going to be reading this issue and looking to the Forge to try to understand the mysterious ways of philanthropy. So thank you both.
Thanks for
Great to
doing
be
it.
with you. Okay.
All right. Have a great day. Bye-bye.